Hello there, listening audience. This is another episode of Unlock the Door Radio here with your host, Michael Cross. And tonight we have a very interesting guest. We're going to take on more of a historical context for tonight's show. Tonight we have Professor Chad Ross, who's written a very interesting book called Naked Germany, Health, Race, and the Nation. Hello, Professor Ross.
Hello to you, Mike.
So, I'm just wondering, you just kind of get things started here. I think a lot of people have the impression of when they think of Germany during the Third Reich, that it was sort of like a 1950s version of an Ozzie and Harriet, but just with uniforms and a rather nasty government. But yet, if you kind of look into the history, it wasn't really that way, was it, in reference to such things as morality and so forth?
That's a very interesting sort of comparison. I never quite thought of it like that. But the thing about the Nazi period that I think is always important to remember is that it's sort of two opposite things at the same time coexisting uncomfortably. And here's a good example. On the one hand, much of the top leadership and probably much of the middle range leadership was very prudish about things. Certainly we know that Hitler was quite prudish about his own body. Yet, as you just sort of compared, at the same time, many Germans were running around completely naked and thinking it was fantastic.
Okay, now, kind of going back, I've studied a little bit into kind of the New Age, maybe philosophies, or how this all kind of evolved in Germany. I mean, Germany has, living in Sweden, you hear, that Germans are a lot more open about this sort of thing. And I guess, what was it? It was in the early 1900s that the modern nudist movement kind of got started. What was the inspiration for it? And this, of course, this is before Hitler, around 1900, 1910. What was the inspiration? Because we don't usually think of those things for this period for Western culture.
What's really funny about what you say is that the Swedes, contemporary Swedes, are looking to the Germans as being sort of freer about this sort of thing that you just said.
Yeah, Sweden's a lot more. Sweden's got a reputation which it really doesn't deserve. It's far more prudish when it comes to public displays of nudity. You'll see it on TV. They don't censor movies or anything like that, and education tends to be. You can have stuff that would be considered very explicit in the United States at the, even the grade school level. Middle school, that sort of thing when it comes to sex education, but you don't see it on the beaches, except for maybe it was popular like 20 years ago, and so you'll see women in maybe their 60s that might go topless, but it's nothing like, from what I understand, Germany is.
That's really funny, because sort of the second question first, the nudists in Germany in sort of the modern social form really got going after 1900, but obviously they weren't born overnight. And in the research for my dissertation in this book, it was clear that a lot of guys, and maybe a few women, but mostly guys, were doing it throughout the 1890s, which probably means they were doing it throughout the 1880s too. And the way it sort of evolved was they were probably, I can't prove it, but they were probably doing it on their own around the house or whatever in the 1880s, and by the 1890s they were comfortable enough with it that they were writing books and publishing about it. And that found enough of an audience so that by the 1900s, the early part of the 20th century, people were ready to take their clothes off, join groups, have themselves photographed, have these photographs published in magazines and so forth. But if I could just leap forward a little bit to the 1920s, when this sort of expands all across Germany, magazine article after magazine article after magazine article talked about how the inspiration of this was clearly coming from Sweden. The Swedes were, in some ways, and from what I'm learning from you, inaccurately held up by the Germans as the sort of forerunners in this nudist movement?
Oh, well, the thing is that my understanding of Swedish history is things have really changed a lot, in the sense, as I said, 20 years ago, my understanding is no woman. Well, at least that's what I've been told. It would be very rare to see someone wearing a top on the beach. And there was a lot more of this kind of open to nature type of philosophy. And maybe for some reason that has changed as Sweden used to be very much connected kind of to Germany culturally. And that shifted. That's actually interesting. I hadn't thought about this. That started shifting. And around from my understanding, the early 1980s, it became far more connected to the United States. Mm-hmm. And to the point that pretty much, if you speak English in Sweden, you'll get away with it pretty easy, because most Swedes speak better English than most English speakers do. Right. And so there is a very strong cultural identity to like places like New York, for instance. So maybe Sweden back, 3 generations ago was a far different place than it is today. There was certainly, even to the point of eugenics, there was a much stronger emphasis on what was called, in those days, racial hygiene and so forth. That's something that you don't hear of anymore in modern Sweden. So the culture has changed a lot.
Interesting. Yeah, I guess that would make a lot of sense. It was just, and I don't know how much when the early nudists imagined a lot about the nudist movement was imagining what they thought a better past had been like, and invariably in that fantasy, people were naked, and it was only it's sort of like a Garden of Eden story. As things got worse, people put on their clothes, and then things continued to really get much worse. So whenever they imagined the past, it was always better, and it was always naked. And for whatever reason, they would sort of look to, at least the ones on the political right, would look towards other so-called Germanic nations as a kind of inspiration. And Sweden was the place that they would always sort of turn to and say, these guys were always naked, and we need to be more like them.
Okay. Well, then I guess probably that was the case back in those days in Sweden. It's a little scratch. You just had a electrical storm there in Vegas, didn't you?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, because I'm getting a little bit of scratchiness in there. So I don't know if that's the microphone or whatever. But it sounds a little bit scratchy. But anyway, I just want to let the viewers know that you had let me know that there had just been an electrical storm. Now, I want to kind of get into this idea of, well, it started out kind of being a health thing, correct?
That was one of the sort of tributaries that flowed into the larger stream, yes.
Okay. And then, from my understanding, or looking at some of the stuff from the reviews I've seen of your book, it started taking on somewhat of a political type of movement to it. Could you elaborate on that? How it was something that was maybe more, it was maybe certain groups supported this like nudist utopia that you were just describing, but then other groups started getting in reference to the working class and all these kinds of things?
The politics of nudism is very interesting, I think. I don't understand what it was that made the politics, the guys on the right, the political right, more interested in it first. The earliest authors, and this sort of how I'm basing this, if we look at the 1890s and the early 20th century, the earliest authors of the books and the magazine articles overwhelmingly found themselves on the political right, and not just a little bit on the right. Many of these guys were using as their own personal letterheads the swastika, and this is 20, 30 years before there's a Nazi party. So there's a lot of strange stuff going on in the political right with the desire for sort of ancient Germanic religious revivals and rejection of Christianity and lots of things that have actually very well documented. I don't know how well understood they are as a cultural phenomenon. But for whatever reason, it was being naked that attracted these guys first. And there's really sort of two elements. There were these guys, I'm thinking of one guy, Heinrich Pudor, that was his pen name, and another one, Richard Ungewitter, who really were on the far right, and they were among the first authors of this. And I don't know what the attraction was other than the sort of racial purity, we hate Jews kind of thing. The Jew who needs to be excluded, there's a lot of anti-Semitism. And as nudism moves into the 20th century, as German society moves into the 20th century, its appeal spreads sort of up and down the class spectrum to a certain extent to the middle class elites, and to a much larger extent to the working class proletarians. And as it does that, it also sort of moves horizontally across the political spectrum, and there become people on the left who are interested in it. And their motives are a little bit different. They're not necessarily looking for a racial utopia. They're looking not necessarily for a class-based utopia either, but there is more of an interest in the writers of the left in getting the children in particular, but also some of the men and women out of their filthy slums, out of their filthy clothes, and into some sunshine, into some clean water, whenever they can. So the goals in many ways are the same. Let's reduce body shame. Let's get rid of body shame. And there's kind of an implicit rejection of Christianity at the same time. But let's also heal. Let's also make people healthy. The two paths might diverge at that point, and the people on the right would say, oh, and by the way, let's let the good people, and you can define that however you want, they defined it as not Jewish, let's let the good people breed, whereas the guys on the left, that didn't come up so much.
So it had a component then, it sounds like perhaps the social democrats, who seem to represent more of the working class, felt that this was a way of, well, kind of like the whole idea of hygiene, making people healthy and exercising and maybe developing more of a cleanliness, respect for the body, whereas you're saying the far right was more into kind of a nationalistic, maybe even worship of the Germanic ideal.
Yeah, that's a pretty good way of putting it, but I would like to add that none of the actual major political parties really wanted anything to do with any of these guys. The Social Democrats are sort of embarrassed by the working class component who wanted to be naked. The Nazis throughout the 1920s and to a certain degree in the 1930s really tried to distance themselves from these crackpots as they viewed them. They changed their minds to a certain extent in the 1930s, in the 1940s, but none of the political parties ever really said, man, these guys, we need to welcome them into our big tent fold. It was always sort of kind of an embarrassment that they were hanging on.
Well, I noticed that when Leni Riefenstahl, when she did Triumph of the Will, there is some nudity in that, and that's for the 1930s. Thinking about that era, you just don't think about those kinds of things. Although it did seem to be kind of a worship of the body even then.
Mm-hmm. And nudity and body worship are interesting things. I don't know much. I can't make a direct comparison to the United States in the 1920s as far as publishing naked pictures goes. But let me put it like this. In the early part of the 20th century, 1903, 1906, really even before the First World War, the nudists were publishing photographs of naked men and women that would have gotten them in trouble in every country in the world, including the United States, up until the advent of mass pornography. They were really publishing, I mean, by today's standards of the internet, it's nothing, but for those days, it's really racy photographs. And they usually won in court when they would be occasionally brought up on charges of pornography or shipping it through the mail or keeping it in train stations or something like that. They usually won their cases, and there weren't many. The issue about nudity is interesting because the pictures are overwhelmingly women, and they're never just sort of topless pictures. They're always fully nude. But where it gets interesting is the issue of pubic hair. And they tended to blot out pubic hair or make the region so fuzzy you couldn't tell what it was. Oh, there's the dog. Sorry. Zoe. Sorry about that. It's raining, so she's going to bark. They didn't mind publishing naked photographs, but there were certain body regions that maybe people didn't like to see in print, I guess is the way to put it. The thing about Leni Riefenstahl and the worship of the body that came up with her, I guess the connecting thought is when she showed nakedness in Triumph of the Will, people are already pretty well accustomed to it after 35 or 40 years of seeing it in these sort of marginal magazines or books. I really thought when I started this project that I would find lots of connections between the nudists and the Nazi cult of the body, and I thought Leni Riefenstahl was going to be cropping up all over the place, and it never happened. And I'm not exactly sure what that cause is. I think there might be two separate things going on. Leni Riefenstahl is widely credited with inventing the idea that the ancient Greeks played their games naked. And in her film Olympia, she shows, I think that the other invention of the Riefenstahl sort of Nazi influence on the Olympics is the idea of carrying the torch. Both of those ideas have sort of never really been expunged from the popular mind about the Olympics. And I think she's the one who, when she showed her film Olympia, which is some 5-hour marathon film, she had a lot of naked athlete photos in it. And I don't know whether the Greeks actually were naked or not. I don't think it necessarily matters. But I think she was using nakedness for very different reasons than the actual nudists were. And she may have just been wanting to exalt the sort of Hellenistic or the ancient Greek body, which is something the nudists certainly look toward. But I don't know of any influence or interaction of either Riefenstahl on the nudists or the nudists on Riefenstahl.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Okay, so let's take this into the Nazi era itself. Usually that's usually considered from 33 to 45. What did your studies, what are some of the things that may have surprised you about that particular era?
A couple of things surprised me, actually. First of all was the rejection of the nudists by the Nazis. And again, it's very hard to tell about numbers. My hunch is throughout the 1920s, when nudism becomes a mass phenomenon, when really hundreds of thousands of people do it, when it becomes normal, let's say, my hunch is that it was probably 60-40 right-left. Probably 60% or more of the groups doing it were on the right, and 40% or less were on the left. So I thought, and these guys were very open about their anti-Semitism. It was not hidden at all. It was extremely clear, and I can give you some examples of that, if you like, in a minute. I really thought when the Nazis came to power in 1933, they would have looked upon the nudist groups and say, hey, we've been reading your books. You guys are saying a lot of the same things that we are saying. You've been saying them for a lot longer. Welcome to the fold. And that didn't happen. There's the process of, it's usually translated in English as synchronization of German society. The German word is Gleichschaltung, where you sort of take all elements of society that might be moving at different speeds or in different directions, and you sort of Nazify, or you bring them into line so everyone's on the same page at the same time. And when this was brought to sort of civil society and groups and clubs, it basically meant that you dissolved the club, you expelled the Jewish members, and then if the Nazis wanted you to come back, they would let you reconstitute as a National Socialist nudist club or quilting club or swimming club or whatever. And that happened, but it took a lot longer than I thought it would. The Nazis really didn't recognize the nudists as fellow travelers for a long time. And there was a very long for police report, a very long police report, probably 8 or 9 pages in typed single space, written probably 1934 or five, where the Nazi political police, I guess, sat down with nudist propaganda and said, what are these guys about? And as they reviewed it, they drew conclusions like, man, these guys think just like we do. They've been thinking like we do for a long time. They're interested in building Aryans. They're interested in building beautiful bodies. We really need to welcome them into the fold. Having said that, nudism, the prejudice by the Nazi regime towards nudism was always that it was a Marxist-Leninist, crypto-communist group of guys running around trying to build an egalitarian society. And it never really lost that. No matter how many times they investigated and said, man, these guys are Nazis before they're Nazis, they never could shake that sort of crypto-communist patina.
So it'd be sort of similar to, I hate to use a modern American, definition. I mean, when you use the term, for instance, left wing and right wing, liberal, conservative, it means something totally different in Europe. Right. Obviously, in America, when you think right wing, you would never think, well, the Tea Party, are a bunch of, closet nudists or something like that. I mean,
that is hard to imagine. Right.
Yeah. So right wing at that time meant something totally different than it might mean in today's lexicon. But it does seem that maybe the Nazis kind of had that idea that many Americans had, like in the late 60s, early 70s, that the naked hippies and stuff like that, and everyone usually associated hippies with the left.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. And in the Nazi mind, if you said left, you were also saying Marxist or Leninist or communist or one of those various synonyms. So for them, left, communist, Marxist, it was all pretty much the same, horrible thing. And they never could. And many people told me when I started this project, you were going to find so much guys from the socialists and the communists out there trying to build, egalitarianism and equality, and we're all the same. And it just didn't happen for a long time in terms of the sources.
Okay, how did just came to me here that did this fit in with the Nazi ideal though of eugenics, correct?
Eugenics was very popular. I mean, eugenics was hugely popular. You made the mention of Sweden and eugenics a few minutes ago.
Well, yeah, Sweden was very much into eugenics. I mean, they were number 2 when it came to eugenic sterilization. And of course, Germany was number 1. Of course, a lot of times people forget the United States was the first to kind of start that sort of thing, but them in Britain. But it seems that this would fit into this eugenics in that this is the ideal, so therefore, let's make more people of the ideal. Is that correct?
Yeah, the thing about eugenics that's important is the idea itself dates to about 1883. I think Francis Galton, an Englishman, was the first to coin the term eugenics. And for its first 20 years or so, up until about 1903, and this is one of my favorite pieces of trivia, the American state of Indiana was the first place anywhere in the world to pass sterilization laws. Nobody thinks of the Midwest as being this hate-filled place, but there you go. So for its first 20 years, eugenics was really what we might call positive. The right people need to breed. The wrong people won't. Define however you want. And then, over time, the so-called right people will win the birthing contest. And it was after the 20th century, for no reason that I can find that makes any sense, that eugenicists began to do the math, and they realized, well, the wrong people, they're not slowing down. It's time to have an intervention, we might say. It's time to start sterilizing here, or incarcerating there. This was common. That's what Indiana did. This was an involuntary sterilization program, I think, of African American prisoners, or the mentally retarded, we can also say. as time moves towards the 1930s, a lot of places do that sort of thing. Denmark, Finland, Sweden, not really the Weimar Republic, certainly the United States. The Nazis weren't necessarily all that different than a lot of other liberal democracies when it came to negative eugenic measures. They were just more, sort of forceful and open about their methods. They didn't hide it. We're going to do it, and they did it, and they did it by the hundreds of thousands. Again, just to point out, I think it was as late as the 1970s when the Scandinavian countries finally dismantled their eugenic sterilization programs. The Nazis were certainly more radical about it. They were certainly more open about it. Certainly less reticent about it. Where nudism fits into that isn't part of that negative concept of let's intervene in somebody else's body, sterilize it, or just kill it outright. The nudist point of view always sort of remained positive. Eugenics, I really hate to say that because eugenics is, it sort of sounds always bad, but the way the nudists thought of things was, if I'm naked, then I'll realize I'm not physically gorgeous because I'll be looking at people who are. And when I see how physically beautiful others are, it'll make me want to change. It'll make me want to quit smoking or stop drinking or exercise, get fit, have a nice, gorgeous figure to look at. And I'll want that because I'm seeing other people who are. And as I'm doing that, the other people will be looking at me and thinking to themselves, man, he's really getting fit. He's looking beautiful. I need to do that too. So there's this sort of mutually reinforcing gaze that was going on. Everybody's looking at each other, wanting to become fit and healthy. And then, of course, once you do that, you would be able to see who had the best physique, presumably the best genes to pass forward onto the next generation, to build over time through sort of this breeding idea of fit bodies breeding with fit bodies, better German people. But if I could quickly point out that the popular mind often associates nudism with crazy sex orgies and swinging and lots of sexual activity. The other part of this was that the nudist activity de-eroticized the body. There was no sexual activity supposed to go on at any of these places, and as far as I can tell, it didn't happen. People looked at each other. They did not become erotically interested in each other. They did not become aroused at the time. And there are a fairly large number of police reports and contemporary reports that suggest that. You would be kicked out of the club and never allowed to return if you sort of acted on your erotic impulses. Or if men got an erection, they would be kicked out.
Well, it sounds like with the eugenic idea, and this is another thing, the difference between the right-wing, left-wing philosophies and so forth. I'm not mistaken in that Hitler actually felt that like a traditional idea towards marriage, one man, one woman, for instance, you hear that a lot in the United States when it comes to the whole, gay rights and marriage debate. But he didn't really agree that it should just be an exclusive man-woman type thing, did he? Didn't he want the most, his healthiest eugenic males, for instance, out there kind of doing, like Plato's Republic, that they'd be raising more seed if they weren't confined to marriage?
Hitler's tough. He wasn't the kind of guy who wrote a lot of things down. Usually the idea of this sort of let's have our genetically best, spread their seed around. This is usually traced back to Himmler's ideas. Himmler, as chief of the SS, was far more interested in that kind of mystical or New Age stuff than Hitler himself was. And in recent years, I've come to think of Hitler as just a bit more pragmatic than I did, say, in the beginning. Whereas Himmler really kind of the chief of the SS, really was sort of interested in sort of these stud farms that are called the Lebensborn, where you would set up homes for women to have their unwed children raised in, or they could go and live at and give birth in. They never really caught on. The Norwegians seem to have liked them for some reason, but they never really caught on anywhere else in huge numbers. There is that idea, but that was sort of restricted to the SS. If I could add something about the eugenics and the nudists, the place that they intended this to be most effective was in terms of Judaism, or of Semites, if you like. And here the idea was one of the reasons you wanted to be naked, or one of the reasons they wanted you to be naked, and this is where it intersects with eugenics, is that you would be able to find out who was Jewish at a nudist camp among the men. I don't know if you know, but European men tend not to circumcise unless they're Jewish or is Muslim. The German nudists were constantly saying, at the nudist grounds and the nudist experience, we'll be able to, well, the women will be able to see who's Jewish by looking at their penises, and would therefore know to avoid them in sexual congress. Presumably these guys thought that you could look at women and tell the same thing, although they don't elaborate on how exactly that functioned. The other great reason they wanted to be naked was to see who had advanced stages of syphilis or other venereal diseases. You would sort of grow, I guess, various kinds of formations on your genitalia in some forms of syphilis and other diseases. So this was sort of how the eugenics further played out at the nudist encampments. Who's Jewish? Who's got good childbirthing hips? That's their expression, not mine. Who has venereal disease and who doesn't? And then you could sort of progress from there to the next generation of better-looking people.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
How's that for an answer?
Yeah, it sounds very hygienic, of that era of being able to determine almost like a breeding farm type of mentality.
Right. But again, you can't do any naughty business while you're at the nudist camp because people would get very upset with you.
Right. Although the SS farms, I mean, that's a totally different story.
Right. Would you like an example of how concerned people were with looking Jewish in a camp?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. In one of the many nudist magazines of the 1920s, there was a section where you would write letters to the editor for seeking advice or whatever. And this guy wrote in. I don't remember his name. It doesn't matter. He wrote in. He said, "Listen, I have a constricted foreskin, and man, it's killing me. My girlfriend and I are really having a hard time getting along. Our sex life is suffering, and every time I get an erection, it just really hurts. My doctor tells me there's an operation I can have that'll make it go away, but I would lose my foreskin. What do the readers think?" A couple of issues later, the answers came in, and one of the answers was, "I had a similar problem years ago. I did the surgery." We're talking like 1926, right? Mm-hmm. "I did surgery, and I got to tell you, it's the worst thing I've ever done in my life. Sure, the sex is great, erection's no longer painful, but I dare not go to a nudist camp, one of my favorite activities, because everybody thinks I'm a Jew."
Oh, wow. Yeah. I heard just, I don't want to go on too much on this, but I heard that in the Soviet Union, that used to be a way to kind of tell who was a practicing Jew, was that they were the only ones that were circumcised.
Yeah.
So a lot of times people don't realize there's a political aspect to some of this stuff.
That's right.
Hey, now after the war, I noted that Germany still has this kind of reputation, but I heard that after the war, East Germany, the communist government kept this kind of praise and even support for the hygienic aspects of nudity, and they would run resorts and stuff that they would for people when they had their vacations.
Unfortunately for both of us, that was the book that hasn't gotten written yet.
Okay.
I ended mine in 1949 with the British occupation authorities giving a bunch of Germans permission to be naked again. And I thought, oh, well, this is easy. I'll come back on my next research grant and I'll find out, how did things develop differently or not after 1950 when you have an East Germany and a West Germany. What did the communists think? What did the Westerners think? But then life caught up to me and I never got around to book number 2. So.
Well, we'll be looking forward to that. Hey, one last question here.
Sure.
Before we have to wrap up, and that is, do you believe that the whole aspect of the German worship of the body, which didn't totally die out after the war and so forth, and the nudity and stuff, was that somewhat of a precursor to the sexual revolution? I mean, we usually give credit to people like Wilhelm Reich and Otto Gross and people like that, but was Germany's aspect of the trying to get back to nature type of thing, and what you've said about getting to this somewhat ideal of, I don't know what to call it, where you have that utopia presented. Did this in any way lend, you think, to the eventual adoption of sexual revolution in Europe?
My most honest answer is I don't know. And I hesitate to link the two because for a long time in the popular mind, well, first of all, certainly the nudists would tell you endlessly that the nudist experience was the most de-eroticizing and unerotic thing you can do. I don't know if you've participated in it in anywhere in Sweden or elsewhere in Central Europe. I tend to agree with them. It tends to make you want to go find people in clothes when you're done with nudism, if you want to be eroticized. The social and cultural conditions of the New Left and the counterculture and the sexual revolution, they have a number of origins that I don't necessarily agree with. For example, and I'm thinking of sort of the Maoist groups that came about in the 1960s in Germany. A lot of them believed that if there had been more sex in the 1930s, for example, World War II and Nazism could not have happened. But there was plenty of sex in the 1930s. So I want to say partly the counterculture or the what was the phrase you used when you described the 1960s?
Well, you mean the 1960s? Sexual revolution, or
the sexual revolution. A lot of that seems to have been, in the minds of its participants, a reaction against the very staid society of their parents and their grandparents. And I think they were sort of self-consciously styling themselves to be different based on a stereotype that didn't necessarily exist, which was they didn't have enough sex, therefore we got fascism.
Okay. Well, it looks like, my time's just about up here. Now, can you tell people how to acquire your book?
As far as I know, you could go through Amazon.
Okay, and that's, let's see, again, I'm just going to repeat that. Naked Germany, Health, Race, and the Nation.
Yes. You can also acquire it from Berg Publishers, which is the publishing house in the UK, but I don't know if bookstores still have it.
Okay. All right. Well, wish you luck on getting your second grant to continue your work there.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed this a lot. I hope you have a lovely weekend in Sweden.
Yes. Well, you too. And thank you for appearing on the show. And I hope that everyone's enjoyed this peek into history that most people are unaware of. I think that was a very interesting discussion given by Professor Ross there. on the whole aspect of nudity and the Nazi Germany. And I don't really want to spend a bunch of time following up on his presentation, although it might, be surprising to people how you could politicize such a thing. But what I'd like to do is deal with that whole issue, and anyone who's been on, political chat lines, forums, so forth, has noticed that many people, many left-leaning people, like to compare the Tea Party, whatever that's supposed to be. I guess it's, movement, whatever. I don't know if you can join the Tea Party. I'm not a member, but there's this perception that many of the left have of the Tea Party and Hitler being synonymous. And that kind of bugs me, because I do know the basic premise of the Tea Party's movement, and conservatives in general, and Christians in general. And by the way, before it was the Tea Party, it was the Christians who were always being accused of just trying to employ Nazistic tactics, and because their beliefs were the same. Now, I have a real problem with that, because, see, the thing is, I actually have studied history. I know also many of the foundational concepts that went behind the Nazi movement. And they really don't have a lot in common with either conservative Christians or the Tea Party. And I'm just going to deal with a few of those issues, because I just think it's atrocious when people try to claim this. I don't care if you're Muslim, Jewish, Christian, Buddhist, atheist. I don't care. The thing is, it's nice to have historical accuracy, and when people have this distorted history of things, it bugs me. Okay, I love history. I just hate it when people distort history. So let's just set a couple of things straight. And you can use these arguments anytime you want. Link this video, if you wish to any kind of forums where people make comments about Christian conservatives or the Tea Party being in some way connected to old Adolf's movement. Now, first of all, I would just say this. Even though Hitler may have used religion in a lot of his speeches to the public, everybody knows that politicians say one thing to the public and another thing when it comes to developing policy. Okay, there are plenty of people that do this. What are you going to do in the 1930s? Get up and say, I want to set up some sort of proto-paganistic fascist society in which everything you do will be controlled? I don't think anyone would really have wanted to vote for Hitler at that time. So he had to kind of throw that idea out of God. Just like, you see it today, even many people who say that they're atheist, but they're involved in politics. If something comes up where they can quote the Pope, if the Pope comes out and says something, for instance, about gun control, oh my gosh, these atheists are quoting the Pope like they had just gotten out of Mass. But you know that they don't really believe that the Pope is in any way inspired or that the Bible is in any way inspired. It's just convenient. And I think the same was true of Hitler too. But if you take a look, I'm just going to read one thing he had to say. And then we can go into some of his policies, which, my gosh, they don't seem to fit in very well at all with the Tea Party or whatever. He stated that Christianity is a rebellion against natural law, a protest against nature. Taken to its logical extreme, Christianity would mean the systematic cultivation of human failure. Now, the thing people have to understand is that Hitler believed that the number one goal was not even to create a master race, of which, ironically, he didn't even look like any of his depictions of what the master race would be, but his viewpoint was not so much to change the human race into something healthier, stronger, smarter, or any of those kinds of things. It was actually to change the human race. And you have to go into a lot of the really weird New Age beliefs of Himmler and so forth to get an idea of what that philosophy would have been. But Hitler was a member of various secret societies back in the 20s and 30s. And if you just look it up, you'll find a lot of connections between Hitler and these groups. And many of them espouse something that, ironically, I find on a lot of New Age sites today. Things dealing with trying to get back to a golden age when humans were different. They were taller and healthier and telepathic and all these kinds of things. Hitler was really somewhat of a transhumanist, although now transhumanists are going to say, no, we don't want to claim him. But the thing is, if you just define transhumanism as changing humans into something different, then Hitler was someone who espoused transhumanism. And if you look up the links between Madame Blavatsky and Hitler's views, you'll see some really interesting parallels. Not that Blavatsky was in any way Nazistic. She wasn't. But she did give a totally different concept of what human history was. It wasn't this thing that the evolutionists promote where you start out primitive, then people start learning how to use rocks as tools, and then they start doing this and this and this, and finally they reach modern day. Instead, the picture of the world that many people in the late 19th century and early 20th century in a lot of secret societies and so forth that they had was this idea that at one time humans were really advanced, an Atlantean sort of civilization that perished, whether that was Noah's flood or something else. It perished and humanity went into a dark ages, not the ones you're thinking of in Europe 1,000 years ago, but a true dark age where you went from high advancement to low advancement. And it's only in only recent years has somewhat recovered. Hitler believed in that. Now, of course, you can look up things like hollow earth theory, stuff like that. A lot of the Nazis believed in that too. But when it comes to the eugenics thing, that should be the one thing that you would see would be totally different in regards to Hitler and his, if you want to say his counterparts in the Tea Party and conservative Christianity. No, they don't fit. I really don't think Hitler's view that the state should be in charge of creating an ideal person is something you would find very common amongst conservative Christians. Hitler believed in euthanizing those who were born with defects, even those who were quote-unquote Aryans, that they should be euthanized. And so the idea was a negative eugenics. Yes, you could be a Christian and support positive eugenics. Oh, yes, this couple here, they're healthy, strong. They should have lots of kids, improve the gene pool in the next generation. But Hitler believed not just in positive eugenics for a certain group of people, but negative eugenics for the others, meaning that you go out and you sterilize lots of people and you prevent them from having children. And many times it was not even based on any kind of mental defects or genetic defects whatsoever. It was just because you didn't belong to the certain group that he liked. So right there, that should be the number one killer right there of any kind of comparison between these various organizations, Hitler and and Christians and the Tea Party and so forth. Another thing I find interesting is Hitler actually did say that he wanted to phase out traditional marriage. He felt, and Hitler later, and Himmler, taking his orders from Hitler, actually encouraged, for instance, the SS, the highest ranking SS officers, to go out and impregnate as many German women as they could. If they knew a German woman who was unmarried or had a husband who was unable to have kids, it was his duty to go out and have sex with her and get her pregnant. And later they had these programs how do you pronounce it? The Lebensborn program. Now, most of the women that went into these camps, these Lebensborn camps, were actually unwed German women, and the idea was get them in there so they'll have babies and not, abort or something like that. But many of them were also, it had other functions as well. If you were a lesbian, or you had a sterile husband, or your husband had genetic defects or something like that, you could go in and, have a whatever nightstand you want to call it with an SS officer, and who had been chosen because he was healthy, strong, intelligent, and of pure blood, and all that kind of stuff, and you could get pregnant. Now, you see, I really don't know very many people in the Tea Party that want to set up some sort of program where they can get lesbians pregnant. Okay, I just don't know. I just have not heard of that policy. We do have sperm banks now, but I don't see the Tea Party setting up any sperm banks. And so, yeah, it just doesn't seem to fit. And so here we've got, philosophically, Hitler did not like Christianity. He felt it weakened the race. He wanted something more akin to Sparta. In Sparta, those of you who've seen 300, actually, it was historically accurate in the sense that if a child was not a certain height and strength and so forth by the age of 1, it was just left out on the cliffs to die. Okay? And it was considered that it was more important for the community to have healthy, strong children than it was for individual compassion towards that child. Try again. Have another child. In fact, in Sparta, it was not uncommon for weaker warriors to ask stronger compatriots to impregnate their wives so that their children would be stronger. Okay? Tea Party, I don't see this as part of their platform. Another thing that would go against this is the whole idea of the state. Now, the Tea Party says they want to have less state interference in people's lives. Okay, more of a libertarian approach. Does that sound like Nazism? The Nazis wanted a very strong state. It was a situation where you were supposed to have your allegiance and loyalty to those in power. You had an internal spying network of which people were afraid to say anything because they didn't know whether their kids or their friends or relatives or co-workers might turn them in, and they could be put on trial for patriotic statements. What does that sound like similar today? It sounds really weird, but something just goes through my mind about internal security for the homeland, people keeping up on what you say, and that kind of information is being gone through and collected and saved on not just people who are suspected of maybe, being troublemakers, but everybody. It doesn't sound like something the Tea Party really supports, but there's another group of people who do, neocons and liberals nowadays, at least the sellout liberals. I'm not talking about your Ralph Naders and some very courageous congressmen and senators who are Democrats who have stood up against this, along with Republicans. But I'm talking about, the neocons. I don't have to name them. The ones that when there's not a war they don't love, there's not a spying program they question, and a lot of supporters of Obama seem to be, from the left, seem to be perfectly willing to sell their souls out for that. Okay, so there we got we got the philosophy of Hitler is against these kinds of values. We have a eugenics program that just doesn't seem to jive with any of the Tea Party or conservative Christians I know of. You've got the idea that the state is your mother or father, whatever you want to call it, motherland, fatherland, whatever, and that the state is always right, and that the state must keep an eye out for subversives, And even the state, well, what did the state do under Nazism? They rounded people up and put them in camps. I don't see any of your conservative Christians or Tea Party people coming out and saying we need to establish any kind of camps to keep people who are the alleged threat to the society. Sorry, I don't see that. I have heard about this kind of thing coming from other sources, but not from those guys. Now, another aspect I think is very important here to cover is education. You know what? I'll bet you if you go to one of the, I have never in my life been to a Tea Party meeting, okay? I have been to Republican Party meetings, and I've been to homeschool meetings. And what's really interesting is that when you go to these homeschool meetings, you'd see some of those people from the Republican Party, those activists, precinct workers, and so forth there with their kids. But you'd see them socializing with, oh my gosh, New Age hippie type people, tie-dye T-shirts and long hair and driving around, at least in those days, in VW vans and so forth, beat up, of course, but refurbished and so on. And the interesting thing was, what united these people was they really didn't want their kids to be in public school. Now, for better or for worse, their attitude was that public schools, well, the Tea Party-ish type people or Republicans were more usually, but not always, concerned with the non-religious nature of public school. Others I have talked to were very much against conformity and materialism that is promoted in the public school system, both overtly and as just part of the socialization process of American schools. The others were people that were, the hippies were concerned with those very same things, except for the religious aspect. But the thing I just want to keep in mind is that Hitler banned homeschooling. In fact, Germany still has those laws in effect, I guess. They're very much against homeschooling. And he put the private schools under control of the state. So, yeah, you could have a private religious school, but its curriculum had to totally match the state. Not something that the Tea Party people and the libertarians and the conservative Christians would support in any way, shape, or form. So anyway, I'm almost out of time here. I just would encourage people to, when you get in these debates with these people that are trying to make Hitler into a Tea Party activist, just put a link to this video when I'm from YouTube or use any of the arguments, because basically it puts a nail into the coffin of the idea that there is any similarity between Tea Party people, conservative Christians, Republicans, and the Nazis. It's zero connection with these organizations. And gosh, I didn't even really mention too much about the whole New Age thing. Anyway, take care, and thank you for tuning in this week to Unlock the Door Radio here on UCY TV.
In a Quinnipiac University national poll, a plurality of voters say President Barack Obama is the worst president since World War II. 33% of voters think the current president is the worst since 1945.
For more news, visit pigminews.com.
This is Ozzy Skateboard, and you're listening to